With February right around the corner, it is looking very likely that we will get another Nintendo Direct focused on Nintendo Switch games. And I think at this point, rightfully so perhaps, a lot of people are kind of reserved when it comes to expecting a lot of exciting announcements in this next Nintendo Direct. I mean, the last one was filled with a lot of ports, Luigi's Mansion 2, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. And while I don't know if this necessarily will all be new games, I actually have a feeling that this February Nintendo Direct is going to be a pretty big one. So if you're new here and you enjoy Nintendo Switch speculation, of course, Switch 2 theories and discussions, please consider subscribing. I really would appreciate it. But without further ado, let's get into it. Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Botox Games, and I wanted to do this video today because I mentioned it in a video, I think a week or two ago, that this might actually be a really big Nintendo Direct, but I wanted to do a dedicated video on it, really diving deeper, because I think it's super interesting. And this all kind of stems from the looming Switch 2 announcements. Whether or not you're Team 2024 or Team 2025, we'll talk about what that might mean in terms of what different things Nintendo might do with its marketing this year. Either way, I think it is very likely that the February Nintendo Direct actually ends up being pretty massive. The reason for this being, they're going to want to show people like, hey, this is, you know, if this is our final Nintendo Direct focused exclusively on Switch 1 game, they are going to want to show people and pre-existing Switch 1 owners like, hey, yeah, you probably know about that new thing coming in the next, 12, 13 months, whatever the case may be, but here's a lot of really exciting games that you can buy on your pre-existing Switch. I mean, that's part of the whole reason I think that the Switch 2 isn't even coming out until next year, is because of how strong software sales are for the Switch 1. Like, first-party software is selling better than it ever has in 2023 on the Switch. So, I mean, of course, we don't have 2024 numbers yet. So it would be very weird to leave those owners high and dry. So I think that in this February Nintendo Direct, we will likely see, I think they're going to go as far as like early 2025. They did this back in 2018 when they announced Bowser's Inside Story for the Nintendo 3DS. And I remember back then a lot of the talk was just like, oh, they just revealed Bowser's Inside Story to let people know, like, hey, 3DS is getting games all the way into 2018 or whatever it was at that point, maybe 2019. I can't remember exactly. So I think we might see something similar here. I mean, this is not an exact one-to-one situation comparison because the Switch was already out at that point, but I think we could see a scenario here where Nintendo lays out pretty much all of their 2024 plans for Switch, with a few exceptions, of course, which we'll talk about, and then even something into 2025. Just really let people know, like, hey, this console is still important to us. Even if it is like a port, like, I mean, I'll just say it right now. I think what they could announce in this February Direct for early next year as something to really show support for the Switch in 2025 is something like Xenoblade Chronicles X. I think actually that game will probably come out in, like, I have it pinned down for like January. Of course, that could change based on whatever new projects Monolith Soft is working on for the Switch 2. But I think this Nintendo Direct will go that far, like reveal a game for 2025, just, once again to show people that they're continuing to support this hardware, even when everybody's expecting a Nintendo Switch 2 reveal this year. And if you're wondering why I think this would all happen in February in particular, like, why don't they just do it in June? Well, I really don't know if there will be another Nintendo Direct that's focused on Switch 1 games. In fact, I'm kind of thinking there might not be. Even if the Switch 2 is in March of next year, we'll certainly know about it in the next couple of months. And then, if it releases in September, like a lot of people think, or this holiday will say, I would expect a big 2017 January presentation size blowout in June. Like, they have to get ahead of it at least 4 months or so before it releases. If it releases in March of next year, I would expect that blowout to happen in September. That timeline's a little bit longer than what it was for the January 2017 presentation, but I'm assuming Nintendo will want a little bit more lead time with this console, just because with the Switch, I mean, they already had Breath of the Wild announced, which marketed that console. But this, we have nothing announced except for maybe Metroid Prime 4. So if we're getting like a big Switch 2 blowout in June or especially in September, I don't think Nintendo would have another Direct for Switch 1 games. Like, I don't think when they are getting ready to market the Switch 2, they're really going to market Switch 1 games at all. That would be so weird, right? Like, imagine we get this big Switch 2 blowout in September or something, and then later that month they have another thing just for Switch 1 games. Like, I feel like, and it depends on what the Switch 2 is even called. Of course, we don't think it's going to be called the Switch 2. That's just what I say in videos because it's easier to convey the meaning. It's going to be very interesting to see how Nintendo handles the messaging of the original Switch games, because we're all expecting this thing to be backwards compatible. But, like, are they going to put Switch 1 games in a Direct with Switch 2 games? Because then Switch 1 owners might get confused. I know that sounds stupid. Most people would understand, like, oh, if they announce this at the beginning of the Direct and it says Switch 1, that's a Switch 1 game. But then people might get confused, like, oh, why isn't this new 3D Mario that was shown in the same presentation, why isn't that coming to my pre-existing Switch that I just bought, an OLED 2 years ago or whatever, right? I'm very curious to see how they handle that messaging. With 3DS and Switch, they were so clearly different platforms, but with this, it is going to be more of an iterative successor. I really do wonder if they'll even market Switch 1 games at the same time and place as Switch 2 games. Of course, barring any like cross-gen releases, if Metroid Prime 4 ends up being a cross-gen release that releases on Switch 1 and Switch 2, that would be in a Switch 2 presentation. So because of the weirdness surrounding the marketing for Switch 2 when it comes to also marketing Switch 1, because of the need for a big Nintendo Direct or Nintendo event revealing the Switch 2 and its launch games and launch window games, I feel like there's a really good chance that February they just load us up, right? They feed us all the food left in the Nintendo Switch pipeline. Maybe not quite everything, like literally not every single game. Of course, we're getting a Pokemon Presents a couple weeks later in February. There will probably be at least a mainline game announced. I'm also maybe expecting like a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game, which could also be announced for 2025, like one of those later announcements. That I could see happening for Switch 1. And, you know, something like Mario Party, that could be announced maybe through a Direct Mini over the summer. Maybe we get a Direct Mini for Switch 1 games at some points. Or, you know, I mean, that could even just be a Twitter drop, honestly. I guess they could announce Mario Party in February, but that'd be really weird. But I really do think there's a good chance that this February Direct lays out the roadmap for Switch 1 games through, like I said, like January, maybe even February 2025. I know that might sound crazy, but when thinking about how they'll choose to market the Switch 2, I'm not sure if really anything else makes sense. I mean, if it's not coming out until next year, I guess you could make the argument like, okay, we'll get a February Direct and then also a June Direct and then Switch 2 reveal in September. But I'm working under the assumption that we'll probably get that reveal a little bit sooner. I don't think it's going to be quite as a close reveal to release as the Switch was, especially because, you know, you've heard me talk about the code name theory, of course. The NX was revealed in March of 2015, and we didn't get it for 2 years. And of course, with that, Breath of the Wild was announced in 2014, and that is what sold the Switch when it came out in 2017. You know, it's not like the Switch was just announced in October with no buildup or anything. Like, we knew it was coming. We knew one of the major launch games for it, and that marketed the system. It wasn't like they just shadow dropped the Switch out of nowhere, and then it came out, you know, 4 months later. That's not what happened. A lot of people would lead you to believe that's what happened, but that is some crazy revisionist history. People knew the NX or the Switch was coming very early in 2016. Now, I am going to do a full dedicated Nintendo Direct predictions video early next week, or maybe later this week. I'm not quite sure yet what my schedule's looking like. So I don't want to get too much into what I think will be announced in this Nintendo Direct, but a couple things. I already mentioned Xenoblade Chronicles X. I think if they want to show that 2025 support, a game like that is, I don't want to say easy, because I know there's a lot of work that needs to go into porting that game or even remaking it for the Switch, but that's like, it's not as exciting as a new game, you know, and I think that is something that they could just put on Switch 1. Like, they don't, I think of like a Monolith Soft new IP, that's obviously going to be safe for the next hardware, but a Xenoblade export, that could come out on Switch 1, I think, and it really wouldn't, you know, upset anybody. I've mentioned this a lot in my videos, and maybe it's just copium at this point, but I think Tomodachi Life makes a lot of sense for this year, given the fact that Tomodachi Life, one of the best-selling 3DS games, Miitopia already got ported, they added that whole new Mii Maker. I feel like 2024, if we don't get Tomodachi Life this year, maybe Tomodachi Life is just a series that's not coming back. That's how I kind of feel about Tomodachi Life at this point. Of course, we're talking about these potential shadow drops of Metroid Prime 2 and 3, or maybe even Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD now with this new GameStop Amiibo restock theory in the ether. Metroid Prime 4 itself, I am still pretty firm on my belief that Metroid Prime 4 will likely be a Switch 1 only game. At the most, I would maybe say it'll be a cross-gen game, but I'm still leaning towards that game coming out this year exclusively on Switch 1. If the Switch 2 is this year, let me be clear here. If the Switch 2 is coming out in 2024, though, yeah, it's definitely cross-gen, but I'm not too convinced of that just yet. It's going to be really interesting over the next couple of weeks to really see what happens, because I think this Nintendo Direct will be very telling. If there's like, well, Metroid Prime 4, like, let's say that gets dated for October for Switch 1, I would say that's pretty damning for Switch 2. If a new 2D Donkey Kong gets announced with a date for this year on Switch 1, I would also say that's pretty telling that maybe they don't have a Switch 2 ready for the holiday season, and they're saving it for next year. Because otherwise, I feel like both of those games would be something they would choose to save for their new hardware. Now, it is worth noting that normally February Directs aren't that loaded. In fact, last year's February Direct, the only first-party game that got announced was Metroid Prime Remastered. And that was like a record low in terms of new game announcements in a Nintendo Direct. But in the June Direct last year, I think it was either 5 or 6 games they announced, and then a similar number in the September Direct. I mean, June and September had a lot of game announcements, a lot of ports and remakes for sure, but a lot of new game announcements from Nintendo regardless, and I think we could see something very similar here where they announce, I mean, we already know 5 games for this year if you count Metroid Prime 4, And if you announce 5 more on top of that, I mean, that's already a pretty good lineup for 2024. Even if it is a lot of ports and remasters, the quantity would be there. So let me know what you think of this idea in the comments down below. Do you think February might actually end up being our final Switch 1 dedicated Nintendo Direct? And alongside that, do you think it could actually end up being a pretty loaded showcase if they are going to reveal the Switch 2 later this summer, like I'm saying? I feel like you don't want to announce Switch 1 games next to that. Let me know if you disagree. Like, do you think they can reasonably announce a Switch 1 game in a Direct that is mostly focused on Switch 2 games? To me, that just feels a little weird. I know they did it for 3DS, but that is a very different situation. But granted, we haven't even seen the Switch 2 yet. Maybe it's completely different, you know? We're expecting an iterative successor, but maybe it ends up being some drastically different device that is very easy for the general consumer to tell the difference from. But until we have something suggesting otherwise, I'm assuming it's going to be pretty iterative, and they probably wouldn't want to confuse consumers, us sheeple, and announce a Switch 1 game next to a Switch 2 game. But maybe I'm thinking too deep about it. Maybe it's not that complex, and they will just announce Mario Party for Switch 1 and have in that same Direct some Switch 2 exclusive games. I don't know. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to get a conversation going. Of course, subscribe here if you are not already, if you enjoyed Nintendo Switch news, speculation, Switch 2 theories, all of that stuff, of course. Follow me on Twitter at BotoxGames and join the Discord that is linked down below. Until next time, folks, peace.